Thank you very much, Mr. Chibazo. And yes, and I trust that since Mr. Rakamba has claimed 10 minutes, perhaps now we should amend the Constitution and allow for equality of arms in that respect. And hoping that that is taken as such, I'll proceed to use that. I'm extremely happy that you invited me before Professor Lokunyango, and in a minute I'll explain why. First of all, let me thank Osia for inviting me here. And thanks to Angelo for a very provocative piece. I don't think it was wildly, aggressively imaginative, but I think, yes, I agree that there were some proposals there that are a little bit, perhaps, that could be termed in terms of a wish list. But we can discuss that, and I thank also Rakakamba for setting the pace. Now, in terms of why I'm very happy to precede Professor Lokunyango is really that when I got the invitation from Osia, I was very excited. But when I noticed that one of the other panelists was Professor Lokunyango, I was immediately deflated. Because what do you say after Professor Lokunyango has spoken? And I know he's notoriously allergic to any sort of compliment of any sort. But I must acknowledge a very important contribution he has made to my political thought and my constitutional thought. And, you know, in that sense, really thank him for the development of that thought. But in that same regard, place a caveat that, as he normally jokes, any useful insight that might appear from me today is totally attributable to him. But anything stupid I might say, or otherwise problematic, is entirely my fault. And so with that slight caveat, I'll launch straight into the postulations, first of all, of Angelo, but also the remarks of Morrison. Angelo basically says we need to reduce the size of the government, we need to re-establish checks and balances, incentives for peaceful transfer, and also to re-establish civilian control of the military. I agree. So in this case, the patient we're discussing today is Uganda. And the doctor is Dr. Angelo Izama. I agree with the diagnosis, but I disagree with the prescription. I think there are a number of things I'll just say very briefly. The idea of constitutional illusions, the idea of constitutional hypocrisies, the idea of constitutional moments, the notion of an invisible constitution. And I think these four things have sort of been highlighted by the statements by Morrison, who says that why should there be a constitutional crisis when Article 1 is very clear about the power of the people, when Chapter 18 provides for changes in the Constitution, you know, then why? It's very clear if you want to change, you know, just go, according to Chapter 18, that there's an entrenched separation of powers. And of course, Morrison is correct when he says that we have a document, we have a certain book that sort of lists these things. But the question about constitutional illusions, I think, then comes. Ask any Ugandan, and I remember people were laughing, I think one or two ladies were laughing when I was mentioning this, because precisely, ask any Ugandan whether power belongs to the people in Uganda. I suspect the answer you will immediately receive is no. And if you ask then the follow-up question as to where does power belong, I suspect that the question will be either President Museveni or the military. And in my humble opinion, this is the truth. Therefore, Article 1 is nothing more than an illusion, and a very dangerous one, because then it allows the presidency scope to do whatever they could do in full knowledge that, well, there's a document that allows for that. I can run through a number of other illusions, but this is linked to the question about his constitutional hypocrisies. One of them, of course, is Article 1. Another one is Article 126 that suggests that judges derive their power from the people, or that the parliament has some sort of oversight role, or that we have separation of powers, when in fact there is some sort of state capture. You have a parliament that jumps, only asks how high when it's asked to jump by the executive. You have a judiciary that has now really been effectively captured and run down, including by the inclusion of really people you would, well, maybe leave it there. Constitutional moments and the invisible constitution, very quickly. And before I talk about this, just three terms: constitutionalism, presidentialism, and militarism. I think one of the items that is not being mentioned today is that more important than a constitution is a culture of constitutionalism. That, as of course, Professor Okoth-Ogendo once said, yes, African countries have had constitutions, but the culture of respect for those constitutions has been severely lacking. So in terms of whether we need another constitutional crisis and a sort of constitutional assembly, perhaps not. we had one in 1995, just 18 years ago. And I may just note that the preamble into that constitution, first of all, noted our problematic history, but also had the promise, committed to building a durable constitution. So in 1995, we attempted to build a durable constitution. And again, we are failing, not because of so much the problems of that constitution, but I think the fact that beyond that document, one needs some sort of broader culture of respect. The second question is about presidentialism, the culture that has been alluded to. That yes, you have a constitution, but the problem again in Africa, as noted by Professor Nwabuze, has been the big man syndrome, presidentialism, where even to issue a license, taxi drivers are fighting. The question on everyone's mind is, what does the president have to say about this? Land wrangles in Kayunga, what is the president's opinion about this? Ministers are fighting. The first question that comes to mind is that I've spoken to the president. Someone is being evicted out of a house. I wrote to the president. Presidentialism. And thirdly, sort of perhaps unique to Uganda, but also evident in other places, militarism. That therefore you have a democracy, but in actual fact, power is held by the military, and they seem to dictate both the exercise of power, who holds power, and how power is effectively exercised. Which goes back to the question then of, do we need a crisis? Do we need a constitutional crisis? Do we need a constituent assembly? I think not. I think precisely the promise of Article 3 is the one promise in the Constitution that is perhaps not a fallacy, that the people themselves, when they get tired enough, when they get sufficiently tired, will correct the problem. And that's why I disagree with you, Angela, when you seem to suggest that the solution to, because I actually think we have a political crisis, and I actually think we have a constitutional crisis. There is a crisis. It's not about whether we need one. We have one. It might be a creeping one, it might be a silent one, but it is a real crisis that we have. And so the idea as to whether the political crisis or the political, the problems in the politics can be solved by the Constitution, I think not. I think that is putting the cart before the horse. I think it's vice versa. The Constitution must arise out of a proper political process, and one which I think will be internally, organically generated. It will happen. When the people become tired enough, they will correct their own system, and they will give rise to a properly homegrown constitution that really embodies the values of those. And that leads me lastly, because I see Mr. Chavazo is raising, the question about constitutional moments and the invisible constitution. I get these terms, constitutional moments, from Bruce Ackerman, and the idea of an invisible constitution from Professor Lawrence Tribe. And this idea is you don't really need, for as long as you have the idea that someone is going to come and create an assembly and allow you to make something, or that right now in the context of militarism that can happen, I think is a fallacy. Instead, we shall have moments. We have had moments as a country where the people have spoken. And I think we shall have those moments again where the people speak. And I think even right now, we do have an invisible constitution. And that constitution is one that imagines and examines Uganda as one for all of us, as opposed to one where a few are in charge of. For instance, just and quickly, yesterday's headline, not the most troubling, and none of the, of course, the fallacies again, that there's Uganda and that we know we have some sort of united country. The headline yesterday, Mugisha, new water boss. Only a Ugandan can explain what is wrong with that statement. Mugisha, new water boss. Nothing wrong with the individual called Mugisha, of course. Nothing wrong with the fact that he has become a water boss. I'm sure he is well qualified. But the perception of Ugandans about who is eating, who is in the thing, who is not in the thing, whether all Ugandans are included, and what has to be done, I think, is the real problem. And therefore, I for one, am not worried. I for one don't call for a sort of a constitutional moment right now, a constitutional process where we come and sit in some sort of gilded house and decide on what has to be done. The constitution will come. The real constitution will come from the streets of Kampala. Thank you very much.